This morning we're going to talk about the sonship. Throughout the course, we're continually referred to as the Son of God, and the term sonship and son is used throughout. And I thought it might be helpful to clarify exactly what Jesus means in the course when he discusses the sonship and God's Son. Let's start first with Jesus. The term Son of God is used in the course for a particular reason. Throughout history, certainly throughout the last 2,100 years, when the term Son of God is used, or God's Son, is used, everybody immediately thinks of Jesus, whether they're Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, atheistic, Hindus, Muslims, whatever. The term is always reserved exclusively for Jesus. And so one of the major points of the course is that God's Son is one, and that we are all alike, we are all the same, and we are all one, and that Jesus, from an ontological point of view, from the point of reality, is no different from anyone else. In fact, he makes that point rather early in the text, that he's no different from us except in time, and time does not exist. And when the course talks about the sonship, it is talking about the conglomerate or the fullness of God's Son. In reality, in heaven, the terms God's Son and the sonship would be synonymous. Since there are no sons, there's only one Son. But within the illusion, where there is the appearance of a seemingly quasi-infinite number of sons, the term sonship would be used to include all of us. Another very important point, in fact, probably one of the most important points of this talk this morning, is that when the Course talks about God's Son, it is not talking about Homo sapiens. Since everything in the world of form is an illusion, then it would make no sense to say there are some forms of the illusion that are higher or that are distinguishable in reality from any other. If that were the case, that would be a verification of the ego's first law of chaos, that there's a hierarchy of illusions. So when people talk about the great chain of being extending from the single-celled amoeba or any other single-celled organism all the way up to complex mammals, they are simply asserting the validity of that first law of chaos. In truth, we are all the same. In fact, there's a rather provocative passage in the text in chapter 28, which comes in the form of a prayer, Jesus praying to the Father on our behalf, in which he says that you will come to realize that even the smallest grain of sand is part of God's Son. Even the smallest grain of sand is part of God's Son. Now, this makes no sense when we look at the sonship or look at the world of bodies from the perspective of the bodies. It only makes sense when we raise ourselves above the battleground with Jesus and look back down, and then we recognize that on the level of the mind, there is only one thought of separation, either taken seriously by the ego or looked at with gentle laughter by the Holy Spirit. But it's that one thought that seems to be real, that when we took it seriously, we fragmented it out into billions and billions and trillions upon trillions of pieces. And each of those pieces then is another form of God's Son. But in actuality, it's a form of God's projected Son. It's the projection of that tiny mad idea of being separate from God, then fragmented into billions of pieces. So what's important about that is to recognize that since everything comes from within the mind and projection makes perception, that when we make our guilt real and project it out, we project it onto everything and anything, whether it's another person, whether it's an animal, whether it's a vegetable, whether it's a rock, whether it's an automobile, whether it's a grain of sand. And what's important is not the form. In fact, that's one of the central thoughts in that prayer I just alluded to. It's not the form that's important, it's the projection. And when we return the projection to the mind, it no longer makes a difference what that guilt was projected onto. Still, another very important aspect of God's Son, when we consider the form of it known as Homo sapiens, is that whether we're talking about a neonate, whether we're talking about a fetus, whether we're talking about an infant, a baby, a child, an adolescent, or a mature adult, we are still talking about God's Son. And we're talking about God's Son as a thought in the mind. So one of the things people would sometimes say is, well, babies don't have egos because egos are given to them by the world and it's not developed yet, but that's not true. The ego is a fully developed thought system in the mind of God's Son, not the brain. Brains certainly within the illusion of bodies develop, right? But the ego is not an aspect of the brain. The ego is a thought that's in the mind. So the point of all this is that we are all the same, grains of sand, animals, vegetables, or Homo sapiens. We're all the same on the level of the mind, sharing the same thought of separation as well as the correction for that same thought.